right, everybody. Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to the presentation. And there we go. Now we're going to put that over there. All right. I noticed that my mic volume is a little low. Let me check this mic volume here because I noticed on this it's a little low. There we go. So let's turn this up just a tad bit because, yeah, when I noticed my microphone is like, that's a little low. Interesting. Okay. Hopefully that's a little louder. Yeah, there we go. Coming out loud and clear. Okay, hello, everybody. Hello, hello. Guys, I've already answered the question about the Book of Enoch. I can't give cliff notes every single presentation. I just answered it. The Book of Enoch is Gnostic. First of all, if you want to go to my presentation because you're bored, you have nothing else better to do, well, you can certainly do so. And I want to tell you all about it. Well, I'm glad everybody's here. Thank you for being here. If you want to go to my website, bishopjameslong.com, bishopjameslong.com. There it is. Oh, there's some thunder. Some thunder outside. Some thundering. You can go over there if you want to and check it out. That's fine. Bishopjameslong.com. I want you to purchase all the books because if you purchase all the books, the profits goes to the MKS Kids Foundation. The MKS Kids Foundation is an orphanage that we sponsor. We just raised money for a beautiful little girl who had a large tumor on the side of her face. And so our community was able to rally behind and raise enough to get that surgery completed. So I'm very, very happy about that. So go team. That is fantastic. Fantastic. Yep, sister. Yep, Tracy Ann. Also, if you want to, so my website, bishopjameslong.com, just head on over there. Just check it out. And if you're really bored and want to find something to put you to sleep, that's a great website to put you to sleep, let me tell you. I mean, it's not like Mr. Producer's website. Mr. Producer, he's like Mr. Genius. You always got to rub it in. Always, Mr. Producer's always got to rub it in how genius he is. But nonetheless, there you go. Now, if you want to go to the church's website, that's usocc.org. Charged with what, Mario? You're spamming that question. So usocc.org. All right. That is the church's site. So if you want to head on over there, you certainly can. And there you go. So today is Paranormal Friday night, where we, in fact, have our paranormal show. And we're looking forward to it. I tell you what, I love the paranormal. I love the supernatural, love the unexplained. And, oh, well, that's not good, Ryan. You need to record it. Got to record it. Make sure you go to the UNX network. Thank you very much there, Sister Tracy Ann. She keeps me focused. She's a fantastic moderator. Thank you very much. Yeah, okay, so here's the deal. Let me just explain again. So here's the Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch is Gnostic. It is Gnostic. Now, Gnosticism is heretical. There's a lot of reasons why Gnosticism is heretical. First of all, Gnosticism means hidden knowledge, that salvation only comes through hidden knowledge, and it's only given to a select few. That's not what Scripture says. So that in of itself is heretical. Secondly, it puts the demons as a status of gods. That's heretical. Then it places the blame of sin squarely on demons' shoulders. That's heretical because it takes accountability away from us. So that is a problem. The Nephilim were not offsprings of demons and women. I wish people would stop this nonsense. It's ridiculous. It is absolute. It's a Gnostic passage. Look, friends, you've been duped. Genesis chapter 6, verse 4 makes it very, very clear that the Nephilim existed before and after the sons of God had relations with women. The sons of God were not demons. Ask any rabbi. The sons of God were the children of Seth. Seth was the third child of Adam and Eve. Come on, guys. This was a book. They were selling this nonsense. They made a movie out of it. They took a Gnostic passage in Scripture and they made this ridiculous movie. And then people are buying it hook, line, and sinker. Jesus made it clear in Matthew that angels neither procreate or marry. So why is this always this Nephilim junk? Paul even mentions in 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 7, stop arguing over endless genealogies and the foolish myths of the Nephilim. So they were not the offspring of demons and women. It just didn't happen. In the Septuagint, that's the Greek translation. The Nephilim means Greek fierce warriors. They're fierce warriors. That's all. That's what they were. They were not the offspring of demons and women. Plain and simple. That's it. So I know people want to think that there were great big giants running around and doing nonsense. It's nonsense. So just kind of you got to understand. Don't take your theology from movies. That's not a good. That's not a good idea. You know, your theology for movies is probably not the best. I mean, maybe there are some, like for example, the Passion of the Christ. Absolutely wonderful. Jesus, he spoke ancient Aramaic, and I like it because they actually said it right. Elahi, Elahi, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forgotten me? It's not Eli, Eli. It's Elahi. So, I mean, they actually spoke the ancient dialect. And even our father, Abum the Basmane Makara Shamuk, I mean, he was actually saying, it was like, wow, this is impressive. So, guys, come on. Anyway, so this whole argument about the Nephilim and, you know, the fierce warrior, just stop. They weren't babies of demons. Sorry, there were no human beings giving baby demons. They just weren't. They were. Just think about how ridiculous that sounds. They were giving birth to demon babies. Really? You believe this? And I have 1 million acres of Antarctica that I want to sell to all of you. Come on, folks. I mean, you know, it's just. So yeah. Oh, sure. No problem. Yeah, it's just, it's absurd. It is absurd. The problem was it does mention giants in the Book of Enoch. But as I said already, the term giant is subjective. Who defines what a giant is? Who defines it? Is 8 feet tall a giant? Is 20 feet tall a giant? As I said earlier, I met Andre the Giant when I was a kid. He was a giant to me. So I would say, yep, he was the giant. You know, so that's the problem. Even Goliath was about between 6'9" and 7'2", and so when you have David, who's probably 5'2", 5'4", well, yeah, in his perspective, Goliath probably was a giant. So it's subjective, meaning there is no objective baseline rule. Like for example, I could say it's 68 degrees in here. That's objectively true. Now, if you were in here with me, you could say it's cold in here. I could say it's hot. Well, that's subjective truth. To you, it may be cold or hot. For me, just the opposite. So that's what I'm trying to say. Okay, that's subjective. So the term giant is subjective. Now, hopefully that clears that up. And I'm sure in 5 minutes, someone's going to ask about the Book of Enoch again, but I'm not going to answer it. We're going to move on because, look, we're here 6 days a week. We have Bible study. If you really want to know about Scripture, if you truly want to know, then show up for Bible study. I go into a really in-depth historical background on all the readings on what was going on Sundays and Wednesdays at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So if you're truly interested about the history of the passages, what was going on during the time, tune in. Tune into night prayer. I do the same thing Sunday through Friday at 10 p.m. Okay? But tonight, my friends, tonight is the only night of the week where we dedicate it to the paranormal. And we have a very interesting presentation to you. All right. There's a scary thing. I'll tell you what. So once I said show up for Bible study, we dropped like 20 people on TikTok. I wonder why. Say it ain't so. Well, thank you. 20 people. I just the moment I said show up for Bible study, boom. All right. Sundays and Wednesdays, 8 p.m. All right, folks. I disagree. I disagree, love. I get it. I understand there are no ghosts, only demons. I disagree with that. And I say that because I've been in the paranormal field for 35 years. Look, here's the deal. If I believed everything was demons, I would tell you. So there's nothing that I gain from telling you, my perspective other than that's just what I've experienced. I've been into many locations where it was not violent. There was no oppressive feeling at all. There was absolutely 1,000,000%. There was paranormal activity. We caught evidence. We caught EVPs. We caught things of moving on their own, spiking on EMF readings, the REM pods going off. The evidence that we've captured in many locations, it was not violent. It was not aggressive, but there was paranormal activity that was not violent in any way. So because of that, I can only say that was not demonic. Now, we can debate as to what that might have been, but a demon is not going to move something just to say, look what I can do. No, when they move something, you're the target. It's to cause terror. Now, vice versa, if you walk into a place that has demonic infestation, you're going to know. There's no guessing. You'll know. Now, everyone, this is for those of you who are new. Let me give you guys a little bit of a hint on what I do. I have 71 pages of notes. On this, I always do a presentation. I don't just look at the screen and ask for you to entertain us. I always do a presentation, no matter what I'm doing, whether it's Bible study, night prayer, no matter what, Friday nights. So I really don't get into conversations or questions and answers because I'm giving a presentation. Afterwards, we can have a conversation and we can chat. If you have questions, write them down, and then we'll entertain those questions. Okay? But right now, we're going into it. Now, I'm going to say this one more time. I'm only say this one more time. TikTok, if you can't behave, I'll put sub chat on for the whole night. That's it. Just behave. That's all I ask. Be kind, be respectful. We'll leave. I prefer chat to be left open for everybody. People always ruin it. But I have a zero tolerance for that. I'm just giving you heads up. Okay. So let's go into this because this is a fascinating story. It's always fascinating. I've had the opportunity to meet Travis Walton a couple times. Well, thank you very much. And I had the opportunity to even ask him a couple of questions. Here's what I'm going to say to you about that. I'm going to tell you that afterwards on whether or not I believe this story. Okay. Tonight, I want you to do something with me. Just close your eyes for a moment, okay? Just for a moment. Imagine you're standing in the middle of a forest. Not the kind of forest where families hike on a Sunday or Saturday afternoon. I'm talking about a forest so deep and so isolated that the nearest town's miles away. Huge towering pines, trees stretch hundreds of feet into the darkness. The branches sway overhead, blocking what little moonlight there is. Every direction looks exactly the same. Every tree casts another shadow. Every shadow seems to move just a little bit more than it should. Now imagine that it's almost midnight. The temperature has dropped. And your breath, you can see your breath right in front of your face. The only sounds are the wind whispering through the trees and the occasional snap of a branch somewhere in the darkness from an animal. Was it an animal or was it someone watching you? That's the unsettling thing about the forest. During the day, they're beautiful. At night, they become something different. They remind us how small we really are. And they remind us that human beings were never meant to see very far in the dark. There is a reason so many ancient cultures believe forests were places where the veil between worlds was thinner, places where people disappeared, places where strange lights danced between the trees, places where something unknown waited just beyond the reach of the campfire. Tonight's story begins in one of those forests. The Apache Sitgreaves National Forest in Arizona. And even today, if you drive through that area after sunset, you'll notice something unusual. There are long stretches where there are no houses, no gas stations, restaurants, streetlights, nothing. A mile after mile of towering pine trees, silence. A silence so complete that after a while, it almost feels heavy. Now the kind of silence that makes you wonder why nature itself has stopped making noises. And here's something that I'd like for you to think about. Human beings have explored the deepest oceans. We've walked on the moon, supposedly. We've sent spacecraft beyond Pluto, Voyager. Yet there are still places on Earth where if someone vanished, it could take days before anyone ever realized they're even missing. There are valleys where radio signals disappear, mountains where compasses, they behave really strangely. And we've talked about those, a couple of them. Forests so vast that a person could walk in circles for days without ever finding a road. And if something impossible happened out there, who would know? Who would believe you? Because the story that you're about to hear did not happen in the middle of New York City. It didn't happen in broad daylight in front of thousands of witnesses. It happened in one of the loneliest forests in America on a cold November evening when 7 hardworking loggers were simply trying to finish another day on the job. None of them expected to become part of what many consider the most famous alien abduction case in history, or one of the most. In fact, if you've ever met these men before that night, you probably would have described them as just ordinary, hardworking guys. Blue collar, hardworking, practical, the kind of men who knew chainsaws better than cameras. Men who spent their entire days cutting timber, not chasing mysteries. Look, they were not paranormal investigators. They were not UFO researchers. Most of them have never even spoken publicly about anything remotely supernatural. And yet, within a matter of minutes, their lives would change forever. One of them would disappear completely, not for an hour, not overnight, for 5 days. 5 days. Hello, Bishop Campbell. 5 days during which police suspected unaliving. The media exploded with speculation. Families prepared themselves for the worst. And 6 frightened men struggled to explain something that sounded absolutely impossible. Because according to them, their friend hadn't been unalived. He hadn't run away. He hadn't gotten lost. They watched him taken. Now, before we go any further, I want to be very clear about something. Whether you believe this story or not, whether you think it was extraterrestrial, a psychological event, a hoax, or something we still don't understand, the facts surrounding this case remain among the most debated in the paranormal history. Multiple witnesses, extensive investigations, polygraph examinations, decades of scrutiny, and still no explanation has truly managed to satisfy everybody. That's why this case refuses to die. Nearly 50 years later, people are still debating about what happened. And here's the part that's always haunted me. Imagine being there. So you're exhausted after a long day of physical labor. You're riding home with your coworkers. You're thinking about dinner, maybe your family, tomorrow's work. And then through the trees, you see a light. Not headlights, not campfire, not lightning. A light unlike anything you've ever seen. Would you stop? Or would every instinct in your body tell you to keep driving? Because sometimes curiosity doesn't lead to discovery. Sometimes it leads to terror. And on the evening of November the 5th, 1975, one man made the decision to step out of his truck and walk toward the unknown. It was the last ordinary decision that he would ever make. So let's give a little background on these men. And for those of moderators, can you please do me a favor and just remind people if they're asking questions that I'll answer questions afterwards, okay? If you've ever worked in the logging industry, it's hard to appreciate just how exhausting it is. This isn't office work. It's not sitting behind a desk. Logging demands every ounce of your strength. You spend 10, sometimes 12 hours in rough terrain, climbing hills, cutting trees that weigh thousands of pounds, constantly aware that one mistake, that's it. The men who did this kind of work learned to trust one another with their lives, literally. And on November the 5th, 1975, that trust, it was already well established. Remember, these were not strangers thrown together for a day's work. They knew each other's habits. They joked together. They ate lunch together. They argued like brothers. If one man wasn't pulling his weight, everybody knew. If someone was lying, the others, they could tell. That detail matters. Because by the end of the night, one of them would tell as essentially the same unbelievable. Every one of them, they told the same unbelievable story. Not because they rehearsed it, not because they became famous overnight, but because something happened that shattered their understanding of reality. And once you've seen something that changes the way you understand the world, well, there's no going back. So the crew was led by Mike Rogers. By all accounts, Mike was not interested in mysteries. He was interested in getting the job finished. He had contracts to complete, bills to pay, a crew depending on him. November meant deadlines, so he wasn't out chasing ghosts or UFOs. Winter was closing in, so the days were getting shorter. Every hour of daylight mattered. And that afternoon had been like dozens before it. The steady roar of chainsaws, the smell of pine trees, the sound of giant trees cracking. So the air carried the scent of a sap mixed with gasoline from the equipment. Sawdust clung on their clothes and their boots, even their hair. So by quitting time, they were sore, they were tired, they're ready to head home. No one was talking about UFOs. No one was expecting anything extraordinary. They simply wanted to leave the mountain before darkness settled in. There's something unsettling about forests just after sunset. It's difficult to explain unless you've experienced it. See, during the day, every tree feels familiar. Every trail looks manageable, but then the sun slips behind the horizon and everything changes. Colors disappear. Depth disappears. The woods become layers of just black silhouettes. And then every tree begins looking like a person standing perfectly still. Every fallen branch grabs your attention. Your brain starts filling in details that really aren't there. So for thousands of years, darkness meant predators. If your ancestors ignored strange sounds at night, they didn't survive long enough. But that instinct, I think, still lives on. So the crew climbed into the truck for the drive home. The heater rattled, the windshield reflected the last traces of fading daylight. The dirt road twisted through miles of ponderosa pines. Conversation was casual. Someone joked about work or complained about being tired. Another wondered if he'd have dinner. Nothing unusual. Until someone noticed a light, not directly ahead, off to the side, deep among the trees. At first, nobody paid attention because forests can play tricks on the eyes. Moonlight reflects strangely, hunters, campfires, vehicles. I mean, there's so many things. So the truck rounded another bend. The light was still there. Only now it was brighter, much brighter. And one of the men leaned toward the window and said, "What is that?" Nobody answered because nobody knew. Mike slowed the truck down, not because he wanted to investigate, because every man inside had become unusually quiet. The conversation stopped. There were no more laughter, no more jokes. 6 pairs of eyes fixed on something between the trees. One of them quietly said, "That's no campfire." So the object wasn't sitting on the ground. It appeared suspended, hovering, completely motionless. No visible support, no sound, no smoke, no engine noise, just light. There was a strange golden white glow filtering through the pine trunks, the kind of light that almost seemed alive as they described it. One witness would later describe it as like metallic. Another said it seemed to pulse, like it was breathing, not flashing, breathing. Slowly becoming brighter, then softer, then brighter again, like a heartbeat. So the truck rolled to a stop. No one moved and nobody spoke. Every instinct told them something wasn't right. Not dangerous, not yet, just wrong. There's a difference. Sometimes you enter a room and immediately feel uncomfortable without knowing why. Sometimes you drive down a road and suddenly feel compelled to lock your doors. Sometimes every instinct tells you to leave before your mind can explain the reason. Okay. Well, these men later described something remarkably similar. An overwhelming feeling that they were looking at something that did not belong there because the forest itself seemed different. You got to listen carefully to that part. So years later, several of the witnesses would recall something that many people overlooked. The silence, not ordinary silence. Unnatural silence. No birds, insects, breeze, no rustling leaves, nothing. If you've spent any time outdoors, you know forests are never completely quiet. Even at night, something is always making a noise. Crickets, owls, wind, small animals. Nature has a soundtrack. But occasionally, the soundtrack stops. And hunters have spoken about it. Search and rescue teams have spoken about it. People lost in the wilderness describe it. I've experienced it. Moments when every living thing suddenly is silent. as the forest itself is like it's holding its breath. That's how they described it. And standing there, watching that impossible light between the trees, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were observing it. It was observing them. And none of them knew it. But within the next 5 minutes, one of the men would make a decision that would become one of the most controversial moments in paranormal history. Again, as I said, a lot of skeptics still question decision. It's a decision believers say no sane person would invent. Instead of staying in the truck, instead of driving away, one exhausted 22-year-old logger named Travis Walton opened the passenger door, which again, I've met him, spoken to him a couple of times about this incident, and I'll tell you what I think about it. And he decided to step into that darkness for a moment. Just imagine yourself in the truck. Your friends are staring silently at something impossible. The air feels wrong. The forest has gone silent. Every instinct is telling you you need to leave. And the person sitting beside you reaches for the door handle. You laugh nervously and say, "What are you doing?" But he doesn't answer. He simply opens the door, steps onto the cold forest floor, and begins walking toward the light. At that moment, none of them knew they were about to witness something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. So folks, for those of you who are just tuning in, I'm Bishop Long, and I am presenting the Travis Walton story. For those of you who have seen the movie Fire in the Sky, it's a pretty fascinating story, a very, very fascinating story. And again, moderators, if we need to put sub chat on, I will do that in a heartbeat on TikTok. Just let me know. I'll be more than happy to put sub chat on. Okay, and we're not taking questions because I'm doing a presentation. I'll do questions later. All right, there are moments, I want to talk now about the object in the woods. Now, there are moments in life when time seems to slow down, not because the clock has stopped, but because your mind suddenly realizes that whatever is happening in front of you is something you'll remember for the rest of your life. That was one of those moments. So the truck idled quietly on the dirt road, its headlights illuminated only by the first few, pine trees before being swallowed up by the darkness. Remember, this was all dark. So, well, and guess what? And you are not going to be able to watch the rest of the show. Bye-bye. Okay. Excuse me. I'm not playing games, TikTok. Goodbye. There we go. Sub chat on for the rest of the night. Because TikTok cannot behave. TikTok has become one of the worst apps for trolling. I don't understand it. I don't get it. So, sub chat. Good job. Okay. Thank you, subscribers. For those of you who are subscribers, thank you very much. I appreciate you. I try to accommodate everybody, and you guys know that I do. But you guys are, that 28 minutes is pretty good, but we've blocked quite a few people already. But nonetheless. So thank you, subscribers. So if you want to insult me, you're going to have to pay for it. And if you don't like it, call the ambulance. All right. Let's keep going before I was rudely interrupted. Tried. So the truck idled quietly on the dirt road, its headlights illuminated only by the first, the pine trees. And beyond that, the forest just disappeared into blackness. The men remained frozen inside. No one spoke. No one reached for the radio. Nobody laughed. They just simply watched. And then they watched Travis. He closed the truck door behind him. Now, well, that's okay. Judy Ann, we can do this for our subscribers. They can ask questions. I'm just not going to let people who are not subscribers come in and troll and spam the chat room. So for those of you who are subscribers, now we have subscriber chat on only. You guys are more than willing. If you want to ask questions, if I see it, I'll be happy to ask questions pertaining to the topic. There we go. A lot of people on TikTok right now are restreaming me and saying nasty things because I have sub chat on because I won't let them troll. Okay. Anyway, before I was rudely interrupted. Wait. I got to do this. This is an intermission. Intermission, everybody. Intermission. For those of you who are angry, who are restreaming my live and saying nasty things because I'm a fake bishop, because I have sub chat on, you have to subscribe. You have to subscribe to the chat. Oh, let's do a trio. Hold on. A trilogy. We got to do a trilogy. You know what this means, everybody. Oh, you're so lucky the battery's dead on that sucker. You are so lucky. You had to replace the battery. Okay, let's get back into our fun show. Fun presentation. I had another one. I might have to find it. All right. I did have another one. Anyway, so yeah, you have to subscribe. But everybody can watch. Isn't that wonderful? Yeah. So the sound echoed through the woods with an almost unnatural sharpness. It seemed impossibly loud. You know, the kind of sound that makes you suddenly aware of just how quiet everything else has become. Here are a few. I think he took a few slow steps toward the trees. His boots pressed into the pine needles, slowly approaching this thing. The others later said that they wanted to tell him to stop, but something held them back. Maybe they were just as curious. Okay. So maybe they expected him to take one look and come running back, or maybe they just simply couldn't believe what they were seeing. Anyway, as Travis moved deeper into the woods, the light became clearer. It wasn't bouncing through the branches anymore. It was the source. So it hung in a small clearing at about 150 feet away, and at first glance, it almost seemed unreal. Not because it looked magical, because it looked impossible. So the object appeared suspended several feet above the ground without any visible means of support. No cables, landing gears, smoke, exhaust, no propellers, no sound. And it really isn't interesting. That silence is one of the strangest part in this story. Even a helicopter announces itself miles away. A small airplane hums across the sky. A drone has its unmistakable buzz. But according to the witnesses, this object hovered in complete silence. Imagine standing beneath something enormous, hearing nothing, no engine, nothing. So that kind of silence has a way of unsettling the human mind. Yep, it was circular. So we're conditioned to associate large objects with sound when something breaks that expectation. So the glow surrounding the object wasn't like the beam from a flashlight. So it didn't cast harsh shadows. Instead, it spread softly throughout the clearing, bathing the trunks of the nearby pine trees in like an eerie golden white light. Every branch seemed outlined, every pine needle shimmered, as they said. It shimmered. Thank you. The light was bright enough to illuminate the clearing, yet somehow gentle enough that the darkness beyond it looked even deeper. It created like a strange contrast. So light surrounded by an ocean of black, really. So as Travis continued forward, he almost seemed hypnotized. One witness later admitted he couldn't understand why Travis kept walking. Another said it was as though he wanted a closer look before anybody else could stop him. Well, look, whether it was curiosity, disbelief, something else, only Travis could answer that question. Now, inside the truck, the tension became unbearable. Someone whispered, "He's getting too close." Another muttered, "Come back." But Travis kept moving step by step, and his figure became smaller against that brilliant glow. The object now towered over him. One witness estimated it was roughly about 20 feet across. Others described it differently. Memories, it's imperfect, especially during terrifying events. But every account agreed on one thing. Whatever it was like anything they'd ever seen before. Now, you got to just... Yes, they did. Yep, we'll get to that. I promise you, I'll probably answer most of your questions. Hang tight. Still got 50 more pages to go. But let's pause here for a second. Just put yourself in that passenger seat. Your coworker is walking toward an object, hovering silently in the woods. No roads nearby, no military base, no explanation. Your heart's pounding. Every instinct tells you to leave, but you don't. And maybe you're hoping we'll have a good laugh at this and later, but Who knows? So Travis now has stopped. He was now standing almost directly beneath the object. And the others watched him tilt his head upward. Now you got to imagine what he must have seen. A structure hanging over him, metallic, smooth, he described this, glowing with an inner light. The air itself, he said, was different. Now, several witnesses later described the atmosphere around the object as strange, almost electrically charged. Like, for example, have you ever, right before a powerful thunderstorm, you go outside, you feel that air, that energy in the air. So the atmosphere felt heavy. The world seems to hold its breath, and most people know that feeling. So inside the truck, Mike Rogers, thank you, suddenly shouted, "Travis, get back." His voice shattered the silence. It echoed even through the trees. For one brief second, nothing happened. Then the object changed. So the men later described the light becoming dramatically brighter, not gradually, instantly. And the glow intensified until it became almost painful to look at. The clearing exploded with light. The surrounding trees reflected like mirrors. Shadows vanished. Every branch, every pine needle, every face inside the trunk was illuminated. And one man instinctively shielded his eyes. Another later said it was like daylight had just erupted in the middle of the forest. Then something emerged from beneath the object. Not a flame, not smoke, not a spotlight. A concentrated column of brilliant light. It shot downward with astonishing speed. For the briefest instant, everything stood perfectly still. The men inside the truck stared in disbelief. Travis turned toward them. And then, according to their testimony, the beam took him up. Now, what happened next has been described in different ways over the years, but the witnesses consistently reported that the force of the blast threw Travis violently backward through the air. His body lifted from the ground, slammed into the forest floor several feet away. The image was so sudden, so violent, the panic immediately took over. And inside the truck, someone screamed, another shouted, "My God." And Mike's survival instincts kicked in. Without thinking, he slammed the truck in gear. The tires spun in the dirt and gravel sprayed behind him, and the truck lurched forward, raced down toward the narrow logging road. Nobody looked back. Nobody spoke. Fear had completely taken over. You got to imagine believing in that instant your friend has just been struck by something beyond your understanding. And the only thing your brain knows is get away. So the truck sped through the darkness. Then one of the men finally broke the silence and said, "Stop." Another voice said, "Mike, stop." The realization hit them all. Travis wasn't in the truck. They left him behind, not because they wanted to, not because they didn't care, but because terror had overridden reason for just a few horrifying seconds. So Mike's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He slowed the truck. No one wanted to say what everyone was thinking. To go back meant returning to whatever was waiting in that clearing. Now, one witness later admitted that he was convinced that they would all pass away if they returned. Another said he couldn't stop shaking. But despite the fear, they made the decision to go back. Now, they weren't going to abandon their friends, so Mike turned the truck around. The headlights swept back across the forest road, and every mile toward that clearing felt longer than the last. No one spoke. Every man just stared ahead, praying that Travis would be standing there, angry, perhaps confused, but alive. Instead, they were about to discover something even more frightening. Because when they reached the clearing, that brilliant object, gone. Strange light vanished. The silence remained. Travis Walton was nowhere to be found. So let's get back into this. Can you imagine? I can't even imagine that. They had to have been terrified. Keep in mind, they didn't go very far. So it wasn't as if they were 20 miles down the road. They just went right down the road, and then they realized, hey, look, Travis is not with us. Turn the car around. So really, when you think about that from that perspective, it's not as if they, Now, the drive back to the clearing felt much longer than the drive away. Every man in that truck was praying for the same thing. They hoped Travis would be standing there. Maybe the light had blinded them. Maybe Travis had simply been knocked unconscious and was slowly getting back to his feet. Anything would have been better than what they were about to find. So as the truck rolled into the clearing, its headlights swept across the trees, illuminating the same patch of forest where only moments before an impossibly bright object had hovered in complete silence. The light was gone. The clearing looked completely ordinary, but something felt profoundly wrong. The forest had regained its familiar darkness, but none of the men felt relieved. In fact, several would later say that the ordinary appearance of the clearing was somehow even more disturbing. It was though like reality itself had kind of reset, leaving no obvious trace that anything extraordinary had occurred. So the men jumped from the truck, began shouting Travis's name, and their voices echoed through the trees. There was no answer. They even spread out, searching behind fallen logs, around cluster of pine trees, through the thick underbrush. Their flashlights cut narrow beams through the night, but they illuminate only rocks, branches. So every few moments, someone would call out his name again, and each time with a little, even more desperation than before, the only response was the wind. Imagine what that must have been going through their minds. Just minutes earlier, they had just watched their friend standing beneath an object they could not explain. Then they saw what they believed was some kind of brilliant energy strike him with tremendous force. They fled in panic, only to return just moments later and discover that both the object and Travis are gone. There were no footprints leading away from the clearing that anybody could identify. There was no blood, no torn pieces of clothing. There was nothing to suggest that an injured man had staggered off into the woods. Disappeared. And the search became increasingly frantic. So every fallen tree became a place where Travis might be lying unconscious. Every shadow, maybe it was him. The men climbed over the rocks. They pushed through thick brush. They searched areas where a badly injured person might have crawled. As the minutes passed, hope slowly began to give way to fear. So they were experienced woodsmen. Remember, they knew how to track people to the rugged terrain. There was nothing to follow. And eventually they faced a decision that nobody wanted to make. Remaining in the forest all night without notifying authorities would only waste precious time if Travis had somehow wandered off away injured. So with heavy hearts, they drove to report him missing. Now, it should have been the beginning of a rescue effort. Instead, it became the beginning of an investigation that turned the 6 surviving men into primary suspects, which I understand. Look, when law enforcement heard the story, their reaction was exactly what most people would expect. 6 frightened loggers walked into the sheriff's office claiming that a glowing round object had descended in the forest and their co-worker had vanished. I mean, to seasoned investigators, the explanation sounded, okay, yeah, sure it did. Far more likely, they believe that something terrible had happened among them. Maybe that fight or something of this, and something got out of hand. From their perspective, for the investigators, the evidence seemed to point in that direction. A young man had disappeared without a trace. His co-workers admitted that they had been the last people to see him alive. There was no body. There was no physical evidence. No independent witnesses. So instead of offering a believable explanation, they described a hovering object from the sky. It sounded less like a missing persons case and more likely a poorly constructed alibi. And word spread through the small Arizona community. Rumors began circulating immediately. Some people believe the men had accidentally unalived Travis during an argument. Others wondered whether he'd been struck by a falling tree, secretly buried to avoid criminal charges. Still others believed the entire story had been fabricated. It's just a hoax. So the 6 loggers suddenly found themselves defending not only their unbelievable account, but also their own innocence. They were no longer viewed as victims of the terrifying experience, they were now viewed as suspects. And meanwhile, search efforts intensified. They had volunteers, deputies, family members, experienced trackers. They combed the rugged landscape around the site. Helicopters even flew overhead while search teams methodically covered miles of forest. Dogs were even brought in to detect any trace of Travis's scent. Every ravine, creek, abandoned cabin, rocky hillside was examined. Thick forests, steep slopes. Yet, despite all those efforts, not a single piece of evidence emerged. No clothing, tools, blood, no remains. It literally was though as the forest itself refused to reveal what happened. So the days that followed become an emotional nightmare for the Travis's family. And each passing hour made the situation seem more hopeless. Look, statistically, the chances of surviving alone in the wilderness without food, shelter, proper clothing. So the possibility that Travis was still alive, it really began to fade. So his loved ones had to confront the terrifying uncertainty of not knowing whether he was injured, unalived, experiencing something that nobody could comprehend. I mean, for the 6 men, sleep became impossible because every time they closed their eyes, they replayed that horrifying event. Travis walking toward that glowing object, the sudden eruption of the brilliant light, his body being thrown backward before disappearing. Some questioned, whether they should have even stayed. Now, others wondered whether they could have saved him if they had just ignored their fear. Survivor's guilt settled over the group. It was like a heavy blanket. If no one else believed them, well, they knew that what they had seen and that knowledge haunted every waking moment. Then came another twist that only deepened the mystery. Investigators arranged for a polygraph examination of the 6 surviving loggers. So they're going to take a lie detector test. Now, admittedly, while polygraph tests are not infallible, they remain controversial. They are often used as investigative tools to assess consistency in testimony. So according to reports from the time, the results generally supported the men's claim that they genuinely believed they were telling the truth about witnessing an extraordinary event. They took the polygraph test. They all passed. Now, let's say you have one really good liar in the group. Well, the others would have failed. But all, and we're going to get there, all passed the test. Tests. They were tested multiple times. They passed. Now, so according to reports at that time, the results generally supported the men's claim that they were telling the truth. Now, for some investigators, that raised even more questions. If the men were lying, then why did they remain remarkably consistent under examination? If they were telling the truth, then what exactly had happened in those woods? And now we get even more crazy. Yep, there's a movie on this. Yeah, Fire in the Sky. As the 5th day arrived, hope had almost disappeared. Search teams found nothing. Investigators had no solid evidence of foul play. But they had no explanation for Travis's disappearance. The story had begun attracting national media attention. Newspapers across the country carried headlines about the missing Arizona logger and the bizarre claims. To many readers, it was simply another strange UFO story. To the families living through it, however, it was a waking nightmare. Then, just when nearly everyone had begun to accept that Travis Walton would never be seen again, a telephone rang. The voice on the other end was weak, confused, terrified. It was Travis. And according to him, he had no idea that 5 days had passed. So when investigators finally were able to sit down with Travis Walton and ask him to describe what he remembered, they expected confusion. They expected gaps in his memory. Perhaps they thought, he had wandered into the forest after maybe suffering a concussion. That's fair. Maybe he had been exposed to the elements and become disoriented. Those would have been completely understandable explanations. What they did not expect was a story that sounded less like a missing persons report and more like someone waking up inside of a nightmare. So according to Travis, his first memory was not of the forest. It was not of the beam of light. It was not of being carried anywhere. His first memory was simply waking up. Now you got to imagine opening your eyes after what it feels like only a few moments of unconsciousness. You'd expect to see familiar surroundings. The ceiling of your bedroom, maybe inside of an ambulance, or maybe the worried face of a loved one. Instead, you open your eyes and nothing is familiar. There is no comforting sound of voices, no beeping hospital equipment, no smell of antiseptic, no windows, no recognizable room, only silence. And a strange, dimly lit environment that immediately tells you one terrifying truth. You are not where you're supposed to be. Travis described the room as smooth, strangely fearless, and even featureless. The light seemed to come from everywhere at once. There was no visible lamp or fixtures casting shadows across the walls. Everything around him appeared softly illuminated, as though the room itself was producing light. The walls curved gently instead of meeting a sharp corner, giving the unsettling impression that the room had not been built the way human beings construct buildings. Nothing looked familiar enough to provide comfort. At first, he believed that he had been taken to a hospital after some sort of accident. It was the only explanation that made sense. His body ached. His thoughts were clouded. He felt weak, as though he'd been asleep for an unusually long time. He tried to collect himself, look around, hoping to see a nurse, a doctor, some indication he was safe. Instead, he saw movement. Across the room stood several small figures. They weren't rushing towards him. They weren't speaking. They simply stood there watching. Now you got to stop for a moment. Picture that scene. You wake up in an unfamiliar room. Your vision is still blurry. Your head is pounding. You realize someone else is in the room with you. Relief washes over you until your eyes finally focus and you realize, well, thank you very much. Thank you, Tammy. And then you realize they aren't human. Now, according to Travis's account, the beings were shorter than an average adult. They had unusually large heads that seemed almost disproportionate to the rest of their bodies. Their faces were pale, nearly colorless. Their eyes appeared much larger than normal, dark and deeply set. Their noses were small, their mouths really little more than narrow slits. They wore identical clothing, no visible seams or buttons or insignias. There was nothing about them to suggest an emotion. They just stared. And there's something deeply unsettling about being watched without expression. Human beings smile, they frown, blink. Faces constantly reveal emotion. But imagine looking to a face that reveals absolutely nothing. No anger, compassion, curiosity, only observation. Like a scientist examining something on a laboratory table. Travis said fear overwhelmed him almost instantly. Every instinct screamed that he was in danger. His heart raced. His breathing became shallow. He looked for an exit, couldn't find one. The room felt enclosed, almost as though it had been designed without concern for human comfort. Every surface was smooth, every line curved, every detail unfamiliar. It was a place where nothing behaved the way the mind expected it to. The figures then slowly began moving toward him. Not running, not threatening, simply walking calmly, deliberately. And that almost made it worse. Sometimes slow movements are far more frightening than sudden ones because they suggest confidence and control. The certainty that you don't have anywhere to go. So Travis reacted the way many frightened people would. He fought back. He reportedly grabbed an object within reach and swung it toward the nearest figure, desperate to keep them away. The beings retreated, disappearing from the room, and for a brief moment, hope returned. Maybe there was a way out. Maybe he could escape. He climbed from the table and, still unsteady on his feet, began searching desperately for an exit. Every second mattered. His mind raced with questions. Where am I? How did I get here? How do I get out? Eventually, he found out what happened to be an opening, and he moved through to another area. And what he found there only deepened the mystery. So the corridors seemed just as strange as the room he had just left. They were smooth, quiet, strangely empty. There were no decorations, no machinery that resembled anything human, no signs written in a language he could recognize. It was as though every detail had been designed for purposes completely unrelated to human beings. Can you imagine that feeling, walking through a place where absolutely nothing confirms your understanding of reality? No clocks, no doors with handles, no familiar technology. Only the growing realization that wherever you have awakened, it was never meant for you. And as Travis continued searching, he reportedly encountered figures that appeared more human than the small beings that he had first seen. Their appearances has become one of the most debated aspects of this account, with different interpretations over the years. According to Travis, these individuals did not answer his questions or explain where he was. They remained silent, adding to the sense of confusion, isolation. I mean, if someone kidnapped you and spoke, you might negotiate, you might plead, you might ask questions, but no one answered. That silence. It was a way of convincing the mind that you're completely alone. Even when others are standing only a few feet away from you, Travis later said he became increasingly desperate to escape. Every passing moment intensified the fear. He had no idea how much time he had passed, minutes, hours, he didn't know. His sense of time completely unraveled. Perhaps that's one of the most unsettling aspects of the story. He believed only a short time had elapsed. Meanwhile, back on Earth, search parties have been combing the entire wilderness for 5 days. 5 days during which his family feared he was no longer alive. 5 days during which his friends were suspected of unaliving him. Just vanished. Now, whether one accepts Travis Walton's account as literal truth, or view it as a psychological experience, or believes another explanation entirely, well, one fact remains undeniable. When he finally appeared, he genuinely seemed unaware that nearly a week had passed. And if that doesn't send a chill down your spine, consider this. Imagine waking up tonight, looking at your watch, thinking that you've been asleep for an hour, only to discover it's next week. The people you love have been searching for you. Police have been questioning your friends. Your disappearance made them headlines. You can't account for a single moment. For Travis, the greatest horror may not have been what he claimed to see. It may have been realizing that 5 days of his life had vanished into darkness. And again, for those of you who are tuning in, I'm Bishop Long. We're talking about the Travis Walton story. The movie, Fire in the Sky. Fantastic movie if you have not seen it. You might want to check that out. You know, there's something profoundly unsettling about a telephone ringing in the middle of the night. I think most of us have experienced that at least once. The house is quiet, everyone's asleep, and suddenly the silence is broken by a ring. Before anyone answers, your mind starts racing. You know that calls at that hour rarely bring good news. And for the Walton family, the phone call would become one of the most unforgettable moments in their lives. 5 days had passed. Thank you. 5 days of endless searching, newspaper headlines suggesting all kinds of things. But now hope was beginning to disappear. Even the most optimistic members of the search team knew that surviving alone in the mountains for that length of time would be extraordinarily difficult. Every hour that passed made the situation more hopeless. Then the phone rang, and it was Travis. Now, at first, the person answering the call reportedly had trouble recognizing him because his voice sounded strained, almost exhausted. He wasn't speaking clearly. There was confusion in everything he said. It wasn't the voice of someone calmly asking for a ride home. It was the voice of someone who experienced something deeply traumatic. And according to Travis, he didn't know where he was. He didn't even know how much time had passed. He only knew that it was cold, he was disoriented, he needed help. So just imagine your loved one had been missing for nearly a week. Police had begun to suspect foul play. Search parties found nothing. And you've already started preparing yourself for the possibility. Thank you. Then out of nowhere, the phone rings. They're alive. They sound different. So the call was traced to a payphone. Yes, folks, back in the day, we had payphones. In the small town of Heber, Arizona, several miles from where Travis had disappeared. Family members rushed to retrieve him, unsure of what they're about to find out. And during the drive, countless questions filled their minds. Where he had been, had someone kidnapped him, was he injured? Would they even recognize him? And according to those who saw him right away, Travis appeared physically exhausted. His clothes looked much the same as when he had disappeared several days earlier. He was noticeably thinner, pale, visibly shaken. His beard had grown slightly, offering one of the few physical reminders that several days had passed. What struck people most wasn't just his appearance, it was his expression. So people who experience severe trauma often have a particular look in their eyes. I've seen that before doing chaplaincy. They appear present, but somehow distant. It's that far gaze look. It's as though part of their mind is still trapped inside the event they survived. And several people later described Travis that way. He wasn't acting like someone who just finished an elaborate prank. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't excited about the attention. He looked deeply frightened. Yeah, skinny. They could tell he was skinny. So as they drove away from the payphone, family members naturally began asking questions. What happened? Where were you? Are you hurt? So Travis struggled to organize his thoughts. He seemed genuinely confused. He reportedly believed he had only been unconscious for a short period of time. And when he learned that full 5 days had passed, he found that difficult to accept. You got to think about that, though. What would it feel like to discover that nearly a week of your life had just disappeared? Not blurred, not forgotten, gone. Even if you try to convince yourself there was a logical explanation, the missing time would haunt you. Meanwhile, investigators moved in quickly. After spending days treating Travis as a missing person, and in some cases fearing they were investigating and unaliving, they suddenly had the opportunity to interview the person who might finally explain everything. Medical examinations were conducted to assess his condition. Doctors looked for evidence of dehydration, malnutrition, injuries, signs that might indicate where he had been. Interestingly, no catastrophic physical injuries consistent with a violent assault were reported. He was exhausted, he was distressed, but there were no obvious wounds that answered the central mystery. Instead, the greatest mystery remained inside his mind. So as Travis began describing what he remembered, the room reportedly became very quiet. He spoke about waking up in a strange environment. And he was very clear this was not a dream. He described beings unlike any other human being he'd ever seen. He recounted his desperate attempts to escape. Some investigators listened with skepticism, others with curiosity, regardless of what they believed. Everyone understood they were hearing an account unlike anything they've ever heard before. And news of Travis's return spread rapidly. Reporters descended on this small community. Television crews arrived, national newspapers. Almost overnight, the case became one of the most discussed UFO encounters in the world. But with that attention came intense scrutiny. Skeptics challenged every detail. Believers defended every detail. Experts debated the physical evidence. Psychologists offered alternative explanations as if they were there. Journalists searched for inconsistencies. But yet, despite decades of investigation, one question has never gone away. If this was a hoax, why would someone willingly endure what Travis endured afterward? his life would never be the same. And by the way, let's not forget that his friends passed a polygraph exam several times. So instead of quietly, returning to work, he found himself answering the same questions for decades. Every interview reopened painful memories. Every documentary brought another wave of criticism. Every public appearance, admiration, ridicule. Look, whether one believes the story or not, it's undeniably became the defining event of his life. But I'd just like you to imagine something. Imagine walking into a grocery store, people recognize your face, not because you're a celebrity, not because you've accomplished something extraordinary, but because half the people believe you're telling one of the greatest mysteries in modern history, and the other half believe you're a flat-out liar. And that kind of pressure would follow anybody. But perhaps I think the most unsettling part of the story isn't the media attention. It isn't the investigations. It isn't even the debate. It's what happened afterward. See, over the years, Travis, he's spoken about how the experience continued to affect him psychologically. And like many people who report traumatic events, certain memories remain vivid while others remain fragmented. So the passage of time, it didn't erase the emotional weight of the experience. I think it seemed to preserve it. Trauma has a particular way of doing that. I mean, you got to remember, many times people forget the ordinary days. They forget what they had for lunch, 3 days ago. But moments for overwhelming fear can remain frozen in astonishing details for decades. The smell, the light, the feeling, the expression on a face. And perhaps maybe that's why Travis Walton's case continues to fascinate people nearly 50 years later, because deep down, some of us wonder the same thing. If something truly unknown reached down into that lonely forest on a cold November evening, what stopped it from doing it again? How many people have walked through the remote woods, looked up at an unusual light, and simply never told anyone? Perhaps even most unsettling, how many of it never came back? So when someone tells a story that challenges everything we believe about reality, there are only two possibilities. Either they're telling the truth about something extraordinary, or they are lying. Remember, law enforcement approached the Travis Walton case with exactly that mindset. They're lying. They weren't trying to prove aliens existed. They weren't trying to disprove them either. They wanted to answer one very simple question: what happened? And the investigators knew they couldn't base an entire case on emotion or personal belief. They needed evidence. They needed inconsistencies. They needed something concrete that would explain why a young logger had just vanished for 5 days without leaving behind a single trace. And if the other 6 men had harmed, and if the 6 other men had harmed him, eventually someone would make a mistake. Someone would contradict the others. Someone would crack under pressure. So they began interviewing each member of the logging crew separately, hour after hour. They asked the same questions. What did you see? What was everyone doing? Who said what? What happened after the beam of light? They changed the order of the questions even. They revisited details multiple times. They looked for contradictions. That's how often investigators expose deception. Most fabricated stories begin to fall apart when people are questioned repeatedly. Some details change, small. Timeline shift, memories become inconsistent sometimes. But something unusual happened. The core of the story remained remarkably consistent. Every man described seeing an unusual object. Every man described Travis leaving the truck. They described a brilliant flash of light. They described fleeing in panic, and they described returning to an empty clearing. Now, did every witness remember every tiny detail exactly the same? No. But real eyewitnesses often disagree on peripheral details. But that consistency only deepened the mystery. So investigators decided to take another step. Polygraph examinations, as I mentioned. Now, again, it's important to understand something about polygraphs. They're not magic machines. They don't detect lies directly. Instead, they measure physiological responses such as breathing, blood pressure, pulse, while a person answers the question. Stress can have many causes, which is why polygraphs remain controversial. They're generally not admissible as proof in court. but they are frequently used as investigative tools. And in 1975, they carried significant weight. And one by one, members of the logging crew sat in the examination chair. You got to remember that. You got to think about this. You just been through a traumatic event. A machine is connected to your body. Now you're talking about you might be unaliving someone, your friend. Examiner sits across you. The room is silent. Then the questioning begins. Did you unalive Travis Walton? No. Are you lying about seeing an unidentified object? No. Did you invent this story? No. The needles move. The examiner watched. Everyone waited. When the results came back, again, they surprised many people. Most of the crew, reportedly, they passed their examinations, indicating that they appeared truthful. Did it prove alien abduction? Of course not. But it did create another problem. If they were not lying, then what exactly had terrified them that night? Now, critics argued that the men could simply have believed an incorrect interpretation of an unusual event. Supporters argued that the consistency of their testimony, combined with polygraph results, strengthened the credibility of the case. And that's when the debate had officially begun. It hadn't stopped. In years past, investigators, psychologists, journalists, people still talk about it. Some suggested the crew had mistaken a rare natural phenomena for something extraordinary. Others proposed that Travis suffered a psychological episode after being injured in the woods. But he was checked out by the doctor. There was nothing there. Some believe that the entire event had been orchestrated for publicity. That's stupid because it completely disrupted their entire lives. Still others argue that there's no conventional explanation. Every theory answers some question, but none of them answered all of them. If Travis had wandered away from being struck unconscious, how did trained search teams fail to locate him for 5 days? If the crew unalived him, where was the body? Why voluntarily report an unbelievable UFO story that immediately made them the focus of suspicion? You got to think about that. So if they had unalived him, you probably wouldn't make up a UFO story. Maybe perhaps an animal grabbed him or something of this, or he fell. That's a little bit more believable if you unalived him, but a UFO story, you know for a fact you're going to be, now that's going to put you right there on suspicion. Why endure decades of ridicule? Why remain largely consistent after nearly half a century? See, those questions continue to trouble investigators on both sides of the debate. I think it's, there was no proof of a hoax. No missing body was discovered. Something happened. So as we reach the end of this presentation, I'd like for you to forget for just a moment everything you think about UFOs. Forget the television shows, internet debates, documentaries. Instead, think about one simple fact. 7 ordinary men went into this national forest to cut trees. Only 6 came home that night. Whether you believe Travis Walton was abducted by extraterrestrials, whether you think he experienced some kind of psychological trauma, or whether you believe there's another explanation entirely, one thing remains without dispute. Something happened in that forest on November 5th, 1975. Nearly 50 years have passed, yet we're still talking about it, and that should make us pause. Because most hoaxes fade away. Most misunderstandings are eventually explained. But some mysteries refuse to die. Maybe that's because they tap into something much older than the modern world. Long before we built cities or highways or electricity, our ancestors feared the wilderness. Not because every forest contained monsters, but because forests reminded them of something they could never control. There are places where human beings are not the master of their surroundings. Places where darkness arrives quickly, where every tree looks like a figure standing perfectly still, where the silence itself begins to feel alive. And I think that's maybe that's why stories like Travis Walton's continue to resonate with people, whether you interpret the experience as extraterrestrial, spiritual, psychological, unexplained. It does force all of us to confront a deeply uncomfortable possibility. What if there are things we still don't understand? Not everything unknown has to be supernatural. Not everything mysterious has to be extraterrestrial. but history repeatedly reminds us that human knowledge is incomplete. There was a time when lightning seemed supernatural. There was a time when invisible bacteria sounded absurd. There was a time when the bottom of the ocean was thought to contain unimaginable monsters simply because no one had ever seen it. The unknown has always frightened us, sometimes for good reason. I had spoken years ago, I'd spoken to a retired firefighter who spent decades working in the mountains of Arizona. And he wasn't interested in UFOs. In fact, he laughed when I was talking about aliens and television shows. But during one conversation, he became unusually quiet. I'll never forget what he said. He told me that the mountains have a way of humbling even the most experienced outdoorsmen and women. He said people think they know the forest because they've driven through them during the day. They have no idea what they're like after midnight. I mean, he described responding to lost hikers and hunters and campers. People become disoriented only a few hundred yards from established trails. And then he said something that really caught my attention. He said the strangest calls were the ones where people insisted someone or something had been following them. Not attacking them, not speaking, just following. And when rescues arrived, they often found only one set of footprints. The missing persons, nothing else, no second trail, no evidence of anyone had even been there. But yet people, time after time, after they rescued, would describe the same overwhelming sensation. They say, I knew something was behind me. Not because they saw it, because they knew it was, they felt it. And then he said, maybe fear plays tricks on people. Maybe it does. But I have always wondered why so many people separated by years with no connection to one another describe that same feeling, the feeling that they're no longer alone. And there's another story connected to those forests that has circulated among hunters for years. No one knows whether it actually happened. Perhaps it's just another campfire tale. Who knows? Or perhaps maybe every legend begins with someone experienced something they couldn't explain. The story tells of an experienced hunter who entered the forest, the same forest, before dawn during elk season. He knew the terrain well. He had hunted there for 20 years. Nothing about the trip seemed unusual. Around sunrise, he noticed that the forest had become strangely quiet. At first, he assumed the animals had simply moved elsewhere. And then he realized something else. Even the wind had stopped. And he later described as though someone had lowered the volume on the entire world. He stood there for several minutes listening. Nothing. No birds, squirrels, insects, not even the distant rustling of branches. And then he heard it. One slow footstep. Behind him, he turned around, nothing. Just rows of pines disappearing in the distance. He laughed nervously, convinced the branch had fallen. He continued walking. A few minutes later, another footstep. Again, right behind him, he turned, nothing. This time he waited. His rifle nested across at his chest, and he scanned every direction. The forest remained still. He convinced himself that fear was beginning to affect him, so he started walking again the third time. The footsteps didn't stop. And according to the story, they matched his pace perfectly. One step, another, always behind him. Never closer, never further away. Every time he stopped, they looked, turned around, nothing. He said he reached a point where he was no longer cared about hunting. He only wanted to reach his truck. And when he finally broke through the tree line and saw the gravel parking area, he felt an overwhelming relief. So he hurried toward his vehicle, unlocked the door, climbed inside, locked it immediately. Only then did he look toward the forest. He expected to see nothing. Instead, he claimed to saw movement. Not a person, not an animal, just a dark shape, standing perfectly still among the trees. Too far away to identify, close enough to know that it had been there. He started the truck, looked down to put it in gear, and when he looked back again, the shape was gone. Yeah, is that story true? I don't know. It may simply be another legend. But here's what I do know. Every year, experienced outdoorsmen tell remarkably similar stories. Story of unexplained lights, missing time, strange silence, the overwhelming feeling of being watched. And most of those stories never make the news. Most are never investigated. People simply go home and choose never to talk about them again. because they're obviously fear of ridicule. See, it's interesting, isn't it? Tonight, before you go to bed, I want you to think back to the beginning of this episode. Imagine that lonely logging road. Imagine the truck coming around the bend. Imagine the impossible light hanging silently between the trees. And ask yourself one question. If you had been sitting in that truck and Travis Walton, your friend, opened the door, would you have tried to stop him? Or would your own curiosity have attempted to follow? Or would you have taken off? Because history is full of people who disappeared while chasing the unknown. Some eventually return. Many never do. So until next time, my friends, if you ever find yourself deep in the wilderness and the forest suddenly becomes completely silent, you may want to trust the oldest survival instinct we possess. Don't investigate, don't call out, and whatever you do, if you see a light between the trees, keep driving. I had told you that I had the opportunity to speak to Travis a couple of times, and I asked him about his experience. And we talked for a little bit. He was very gracious, was very, very gracious, incredibly kind, and gracious with his time. I was able to, as at a paranormal conference, so I was able to speak to him before the doors opened. There was a lot of people. Very, very kind. And I said, I'm very interested in this as clergy. You know, we're talking about UFOs and aliens of this nature. I said, I do believe that alien life exists, but from your perspective, do you believe that you absolutely, without question, do you believe that you were abducted? And he looked right at me. He says, I don't think. I said, I absolutely know I did. I know I was. And we talked for a little bit afterwards. Here's what I'll say about Travis after having my conversation with him. You know, being in the field for 35 years and doing lots and lots of interviews about people who claim there's demons in their homes and things of this nature, you kind of get a sixth sense kind of a thing of when someone's just telling you a fib. Travis, in my opinion, was telling the truth. And I am absolutely convinced that he experienced something extraordinary, without question. I did not get the sense in any way, shape, form, or fashion that he was making it up at all. At all. So in my opinion, based on the conversation that I had with him, I do believe he was telling the truth, which makes it even more fascinating. So there you are, my friends. That is the story of the Travis Walton experience. Fascinating, isn't it? There is a movie called Fire in the Sky. If you've not seen it, you might want to take a look at it. It's pretty fascinating. It really is very fascinating. For those of you who are listening to this on podcast, we say good night. Can you believe it's already like that? I mean, what happened? Talking about time, it just goes by so fast, doesn't it? So I am going to upload this on podcast. That way, for those of you who want to, let's see, Paranormal Friday. Let me do this very quickly. Oh, well. Yeah, that way it's always up there for you. And then you can have it. Okay. Nope, we don't want that. We want this. All right, so what you do is go to bishopjameslong.com and you click on the podcast links, and then you go down to where it says Sacred Division, and it is now published. All right, so there it is, friends. Listen, I want to remind you that we're gonna go ahead and stop just a little earlier. We're going to have our night prayer coming up at the top of the hour. So don't forget, we have night prayer. So please join us then, if you would. Yeah, I'll answer the Pope's Exorcist. I thought it was a terrible movie. It was a horrible movie. As a matter of fact, I even left because it was so stupid at the end. I just thought I can't watch this anymore. It was just ridiculous. It was very good in the beginning, but then it just plummeted. Okay, friends, remember, your value does not decrease based on someone's inability or refusal to see your worth. You are priceless, and do not let anybody tell you or convince you otherwise. Good night.